I will go ahead and call the meeting to order here at 8:11 a.m. Couple of things, old business discussion of FY27 budget. Just want to provide the update here through this forum that the warrant committee had a meeting on Monday night. They voted unanimously to approve the FY27 budget request from the school department. So that has been approved now by us and by the warrant committee, and we'll be going to town meeting. The other article they discussed was the $500,000 free cash allocation to the Special Ed Stabilization Fund. That was also approved unanimously by the warrant committee. So that is a select board policy or warrant article, I should say, that select board approved and the warrant committee has approved, and that's moving forward to town meeting. So all the warrant articles associated with the schools, other than the capital budget, which they haven't voted on just yet, but I think voting on tomorrow. All the other ones have been approved by the warrant committee. So that was that update. We are here to talk through some policies. So we have kind of the primary policy we want to start with is the Special Ed Stabilization Fund, because now we're going to have money put into it and we should have a policy around what we're trying to do with that, how we withdraw funds and what the target balances are. Katie within the folder put some a draft policy she typed up and some sample policies she had actually shared prior week. If you turn it over to you, is there any kind of framing you want to walk us through?
Sure. I'm just sorry, just leave the folder now.
Yeah. Share my screen.
So start with the Special Ed Stabilization financial policy. Okay, so what I did to create the draft for this policy was I did very much look at some of the policies that I could find from other districts, and then I tried to just modify it for what I thought made sense for Milton. There are definitely a few pieces that I think we would have to discuss, mainly around the funding ceiling and the funding floor. And then also I think that it would be valuable to have a conversation about the funding mechanism for transfers into the stabilization fund. So just starting at the top, the overall objective, it just makes reference to the Mass General Law, which allows us to establish the stabilization funds. And just there's just a note there saying kind of the intent of the stabilization fund is to provide proactive strategic approach for unforeseeable, unbudgeted special education costs, and truly to provide stability in the current fiscal year in the delivery of education that could otherwise be impacted. The purpose, again, is to provide for payment of unbudgeted and unforeseen expenses without forcing cuts to other school services. Then the policy further goes into the process for transfers in. So typically in these policies, you do see language around the funding ceiling, which is kind of the most that can be the highest balance that can be retained in the fund, and then the targeted funding floor, which is the minimum balance. And really, once you get to that minimum balance, that should really trigger the conversation. If there isn't already an established funding mechanism, that should then trigger the conversation of, yes, we can utilize the funds that are in the stabilization account, but we really do need to formulate a plan to be able to restore the funds just in case something does happen in the future that would cause us to have to utilize the stabilization fund again. So one of the funding mechanisms is mentioned in the transfer in language, and that's undesignated fund balance, which is free cash. Free cash is held on the town side. It is not controlled by the school department. The school department can contribute to free cash by the way of having excess operating budget funds at the end of a fiscal year. But the town and the select board control, and the town administrator, by way of the town administrator, would need to have free cash available that could be transferred into the stabilization fund. And the timing around that, I don't know if I put in language around the timing, that's typically would be a warrant article at town meeting to be able to fund or transfer funds into stabilization. The balance, this language is specifically written in Mass General Law, so that's something that there is not any flexibility. The only flexibility comes in the fact that net school spending will fluctuate and it generally will increase. But the balance in the reserve fund cannot exceed 2% of annual net school spending of the school district. And so I did pull in the last available net school spending numbers that have been certified by the state was fiscal year 24. So you can see that $72 million. So the 2% of that is about 1.4 million. And that would be the overall total amount that we could have in the account.
Thanks.
Of course.
Just only when I was reading this paragraph, it was a little confusing.
Yeah.
So should we, and I think it says the target funding ceiling shall be 500,000, but then we go down and talk about this 1.499. So do we need to be even more explicit or somehow say what you just said, that like what you're talking about there, the balance reserve shall not, that's Mass General Law.
Yes.
Versus this is our
policy. Yeah.
I just think somehow just distinguish, putting some line in there, like just say that would be helpful just to clarify. So
yeah,
we're not saying.
And maybe even reversing, like just putting the balance as like the first line. I've worked in districts where our funding ceiling was just the 2% of net school spending. We didn't have a number in the policy that was 500,000, 600,000. So we do have some flexibility there that we can truly in our policy or in the policy just determine what we want that funding ceiling to be.
Nathan?
Katie, that was kind of my question. I was wondering if the 500,000 target funding ceiling is a placeholder or a recommendation from you, and if the latter, just to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. So it is a recommendation. I kind of took the examples and put everything in and didn't necessarily So it's kind of one or the other when you look at the funding ceiling, and the 500,000 was just a reference to the amount that is going to be deposited into the fund, but it's totally up to, the committee's discretion, whether we want to keep the 500,000 or we could just use the 2% of net school spending as that funding ceiling. And that again is a target, but I think that if that is the mechanism that is chosen, then it will put importance on defining what the funding source is going to be, because we won't be able to get to that funding ceiling if we don't have a way to provide funds to the stabilization account.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm struggling with exactly how we determine what that number should be. And in your two examples, one had 500,000, one had 950. What drives those two numbers, and obviously how this coordinates with the funding balance we have within circuit breaker. So we are keeping some rollover funds in circuit breaker is our goal. The amount within this fund
not need to be quite as robust. If we have 2.7 million in that, then
Yes.
maybe we don't need 1.5 in this. So I don't know how to have those two things necessarily like speak to each other in kind of a clear mathematical way.
Yeah, I feel like in some meeting we had recently, I don't know if it was the last finance committee meeting, we were talking about this, and someone asked just for like examples of when of case use cases of when we might use these funds. I wonder if that's the best sort of starting point, and eventually after a few years of use, we might actually have some actuals out of this fund that would tell us what the appropriate target ceiling is.
And I think further down in the policy, there is language that says that the policy should be reviewed annually. And that's a really important part of it. So even if it was decided that the funding ceiling is going to be 500,000, you can always review it every year and make changes to it. If we haven't used the 500,000, then there's just flexibility, and it should be kind of an iterative process. It's not a policy that would be set because there are numbers referenced to it that would be set, and then it's just good forever. So I think that there's definitely an ability to say, okay, we're going to set it at this amount for now, see if it's utilized in the upcoming year, kind of what the overall utilization is, and if we have to increase or decrease it, that can happen.
Is there for the floor, to me, seems like the more important of the two, in that we want to make sure we have a robust amount that stays in that account. It's planned to kind of get back to that. For that, is there something around, again, what y'all are seeing around average kind of unanticipated out of district placement costs on this work kind of things are very wildly here, but like an amount that in your mind, I know the 100,000 came from like another town's policy, but is there an amount that feels like kind of going below that really limits our flexibility to accommodate for kind of those unexpected costs?
I think it's just having the floor is just calling to the fact that you don't want to be dependent on the stabilization fund if you do have those expenses come up to the point that you're depleting the fund year over year. Because if you're doing that, then that's when you should look at kind of the overall funding sources and say maybe we need to concentrate on contracted services, or looking at what our balances in circuit breaker. So I think that's why with stabilization funds, and I think it would be similar on the town side, they never want to have a stabilization fund have the utilization draw that back to zero. So that's why I do think the funding floor is important. I think that there can be flexibility around the amount. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100,000. It could be 50,000. But again, it's just, I think the important piece is just going to be looking at the utilization and how much you have to and how often you have to use the stabilization.
Yeah, and the two examples, Bedford had 200,000, Cohasset had the numbers were matched the Cohasset sample. Yeah, I was not thinking lowering that number, I was thinking more of like doing it up to 200, 200. And then, yeah, the other thing I did have, which I didn't see in any of the other sample policies, but to your point of like these are set numbers and then they probably need to be adjusted over time, especially costs rise, the budget rises. Is there some just metric we put in to say shall be 500,000 for fiscal year 27 and shall increase 2% annual increase sometimes. So it's a little change. I don't know, something that helps keep the amount more evergreen.
What are those that annual review of it does that? Do you know what I mean? Because then if you are not utilizing it, and you've got the 500 staying there, do you look at it that, I think having it reviewed annually and reviewing the usage data would be that, as opposed to putting
Putting
in
in
a
something.
percentage that might not be, might be like, well, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, Nathan.
No, you're good. I was processing live. Were you, sorry, I just want to check and see if I missed this because your conversation is making me think of this. I'm thinking about the consultants report recommendations on circuit breaker. Was that part of, did I miss, is that part of this conversation here that you all were just having?
No, we hadn't referenced it yet.
I was just thinking about the balance, and it kind of made me think of that report. And I know the report was saying that our circuit breaker balance should be relative to the growth in circuit breaker expenditures year over year, something along those lines. And Katie, correct me if I'm getting any of this sort of conceptually wrong, but if a circuit breaker balance is meant to provide a reserve to account for sort of medium-term growth in high-cost special education expenditures, the special education stabilization fund is meant to account for one-time in-year like economic shocks. Could we think about a balance that is equivalent to 1 year growth in circuit breaker? Like I might think that 1 year, typical 1 year growth in circuit breaker might be a function of both cost increases and just new expenditures, like new student needs or new students that require certain services. I wonder if does that make sense at all?
I think it does. It definitely makes sense to me, but I'm just more concerned about the fact that we don't necessarily control how the account is funded. And so we could put a number of different parameters or calculations in place to define what we think the funding ceiling should be, but it's going to be up to the town to say if they're going to be able to allocate free cash to that account every single year.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just worry more about that. I think, and so just to kind of talk through how this has been done before, in my experience, the funding ceiling was just the cap that was set by Mass General Law. So that was the 2% of net school spending, which is 1.4 million. That's just saying that's the most that we can have in the account at any given time. The funding mechanism that we used is any surplus funds in the school's operating budget at the end of the year would be turned back to the town, as it should be, and as every municipality operates in every department. And then whatever that balance is certified as free cash and then goes into the stabilization fund. So we knew as we were managing the budget, there may be some years where there's no balance. And so there's no contribution, at least from the year-end balances. But then on certain years, we knew that if we had $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever the number is at the end of the fiscal year, that would be certified as free cash. And then that was the contribution into the account. So at least we knew what that mechanism was, and we tried to utilize other funding sources before we used the stabilization fund so we could continue to kind of grow that balance. In this example, we know we're getting the 500,000. So that's the reference in the policy. We know that we want to set a funding floor because you don't want to just be wiping out back to zero every single year. I think it's just how how and if the fund is going to have some mechanism to contribute to it year over year, that's going to drive kind of what we can have as the ceiling and what we should be looking at as the floor.
Can I ask a point of clarification? So because the mechanism for funding it is done by the town, not by the school. It's like to put it's not in our hands. So to say 1%, 2%, whatever the percentage is or the amount, we can put it in there.
Yes.
But because we are not the ones weighing in or determining the policy for contributing free cash to that because of the town policy, it's somewhat arbitrary.
Yes.
Lizzie?
Thanks. So I remember at the last meeting with members of the Select Board Finance Subcommittee, there was sort of conversation about collaborating to sort of move this forward. And my question is, first of all, Katie, as you look at other model communities that have set this up well, is there sort of an accompanying policy at the select board that mirrors the school committee's policy for the special ed reserve account? And I definitely may have missed it because I haven't been up on everything, but is this select board like a twin policy, or would that be a path to explore? I think we talked about we were gonna create like a draft we were gonna create sort of a draft, move it forward and then share it back with them. Is that what we talked about? Because to me, that's sort of the part about, yes, it's not in our control, but it is in our control to work with them to help them set a similar policy that at least states goals of a ceiling and a floor.
Yeah, I can answer the second part of that, which is, I think you understand it well. That's my understanding is we're crafting a policy that hopefully will need to be adopted by both the schools and the town because it's a joint account. Funds cannot be withdrawn from the account without both school committee vote and select board vote. So both of the entities need a policy around this. Again, the funding mechanism is more driven by the town, as is all funding within the town. It's driven by the select board more so than us. But yeah, the goal is to create a draft here that we feel good about, and we pass it over to the select board, and hopefully they feel good about it. And we both vote to adopt it as one of our fiscal policies. So I agree with you, Lizzie. I think we could have language, and I put this like some of the other policies had that language within it, and think we should try and make that clear for the select board that this is what we are proposing as the avenue for funding it, which removes free cash from them, from their ability to kind of control moving forward. So like they may have feelings about that, right? If we have $50,000 left and that goes to them, then in a normal year, the town determines what are they going to do with that 50,000? Where are they putting it? And we would want to have within this policy that no, that 50,000, we all agree that 50,000 that comes from the school is going to go into the special ed stabilization fund. I think that does link to like up until what point, right? Are we going to continually fund this through those kind of we assume they're going to be small deposits year over year until we hit 1.44, and that number will only grow. We'll probably grow at a rate that's faster than we can contribute to the policy. So like, are we just kind of always going to be slowly funding and building up the fund, or is there some lower level that we are funding it to and saying, hey, it's 500,000, and so we wouldn't put in any additional funds into the account until the fund balance falls below 500,000, and then slowly add it to get it back up. So that's why I think like whatever this target funding ceiling is important to say that, you know, I don't think we should have a fund that just constantly builds up. I don't think we need that right now. And again, maybe we change that in the future, but I don't know if 500,000 is the right maximum amount or not. It's a great starting place.
I I think they're so intertwined, like this and the circuit breaker, like what the policy around the amount that we hold in reserves in circuit breaker
Mhm.
is. And so if we have a policy that said, where we have agreed to the amount that we carry that we hold in circuit breaker. And then like this feels like the backstop, right? This is that's depleted, we've done that, then we're going here. And if we have a number that we feel is, where we've landed, where we're saying, that it's a robust number, that's a strong number, it's then I feel like 500 here is a cap, like 500 feels like plenty. Like I feel like looking at that 2% feels very high for this, knowing that the goal really is to have the circuit breaker be a robust fund. And so, I think, and I'm not saying you picked an arbitrary number, Katie, but it was sort of like 500 because that's what we know we're getting. And that's the one set amount. And then we look at it after that and make sure that we're very clear and that we feel like we have the right number for circuit breaker first. And then we revisit this 500 year to year based on the need to dip into it based on the reserves that we have. Makes sense. Because I feel like this is very important for me. Circuit breaker policy feels really like that.
It's just, it's such a bigger
It's such a
number
bigger
that we
number.
are, as a bank,
It's-
yeah.
So
No, I
that's
agree.
just where I am.
To Nathan's question of like, the growth in circuit breaker as potential metric, it really jumps.
Right.
The average, Katie provided us kind of that chart with the numbers previously, and I did like the change year over year. The average change is an increase of about 174,000. But again, we had a year where we dropped 477,000, a year where it went up 800,000. So like what the median is. Median's like around 100,000 in terms of like annual change increase. So if that is a mechanism, then 500,000 is 2.5 years kind of worth of circuit breaker change. It's kind of on the higher end of a big jump up in circuit breaker. $100,000 is about kind of the median amount that we've seen changed.
So the only piece that I want to add to is thinking about kind of the language around if the balance of the fund drops below the funding floor, the town and schools will formulate a plan to restore the fund. And so thinking about that, if we're setting the ceiling at 500,000 and the floor is 100,000, there truly is 400,000 that we can utilize. 400,000 when we're talking about these unanticipated expenses.
Yep.
Because I'm thinking of the placement that is kind of a significant expense. 400,000, it could be potentially one placement. And so it's just not a lot. And so that could happen in 1 year, and you could essentially be back to the drawing board next year and having to talk about a plan to restore the fund. And I would just never want that to prohibit being able to utilize the funding when you need it. And so I don't know if it makes sense to maybe potentially give just a little bit more of a cushion of the range, thinking about what we would want the utilization to be and thinking about being able to utilize it multiple times. I think if the funding ceiling was, say, 750,000, then the utilization range is $650,000. And there isn't a placement that I know of that wouldn't be, that would potentially be multiple instances of having to use the fund. And that to me just seems a little bit more realistic. And just gives that cushion and the timing to be able to say, okay, now we used it, now we need to go back and potentially talk about how we're gonna fund it again.
So you're using the scenario of essentially the highest out of district
Yes.
placement cost that you
Mhm,
know of,
mhm.
plus. Do you know what I mean? Like plus
Yes,
other, what might be another lesser expense or contracted services or transportation.
correct.
Yeah, just to not wipe the entire fund
Yes.
balance out within a
In one
single.
instance.
Yeah.
Right.
So what's the highest that we've ever seen? Is it 6? So we've had $600,000 chunks. So in my head, I was using the same number. So if you use that all scoop, you're still not exhausting it below 100.
Yeah.
So you do seven.
Mhm. Yeah. Just because that makes sense. I think only giving ourselves 400,000 to use, that to me is like, could potentially be gone in 1 year.
It's almost, yeah.
So it's just not.
So given that the target funding ceiling will be above what's going to be allocated obviously this year, I think it probably makes sense to try and put in some language around the transfer ins related to what you talked about and kind of what is in the sample policy
Right.
of surplus from the school department budget. Obviously, again, it's like board might have pushback concern about that, but I think that gives us a mechanism that is within our control to fund that, fund the fund over time. Gives us some incentive to.
Yeah, definitely, you would think that the select board of the town plan would look at that as an incentive approach for us to be more thoughtful about. We're not just waiting for them to put money in there, that we're contributing to that. And I guess I apologize for missing the beginning of the meeting, but are we looking at this fund as only a backstop? This is only just in case, this is only the unpredictable one.
Mhm.
We're not looking for this to replace our circuit breaker piece, because I think some folks on the town side, when they raised the idea, well, what does it look like in Wellesley? And it was like 3 million in the Wellesley one, that they were actually supplanting the circuit breaker mechanism that we have within our budget with that fund. And Katie, I think you and I agree that we do not want to do that. We want to
No.
keep that all in our hands.
Yep.
This is just the break glass. When 2 kids came in with a 300 and a 300, or one that was our experience this year, came in July at a 600, and we just, even if we were well positioned
Mhm.
with a circuit breaker being at a healthy amount, we would have a hard time absorbing that 600.
So then putting, to your point, then putting in language that if the school, like whatever the whatever we word it, then the funding, like if there was money left, the schools,
Mhm.
that would be earmarked for
Mhm.
returns.
I do like, the reason that I put that last sentence of the fund balance may be transferred into the stabilization fund is I think it provides flexibility in the fact that it's generic and it's not just on the school department. It does say to the town, if there is a year that that chapter 70, so the school aid from the state increases, and it wasn't budgeted for, that then becomes free cash, and that could then go into the stabilization fund.
Yeah.
So I did just like how generic it was, because it provides flexibility on the town side to do more than just what the surplus number is.
Yeah, I worry that the generic. There are just so many demands on free cash within the town, obviously capital, and a lot of other needs.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so I think without something that is more. This may be agreed upon by the select board, but is more kind of clearly stating like, this is what we're expecting. But to your point, we can't even directly allocate our unused resources into the fund. Like we would still need the select board and the town meeting to approve,
Yes.
recommend and approve those things. And so I think like stating that clearly within the policy to say, that way we can go in front of town meeting and say, this is why this $23,000 is going to special ed stabilization fund. This is for the policy. We haven't met the 750,000. Schools were under budget last year, and so we're just gonna put this in this kind of rainy day fund.
Mhm.
I think that in my mind is helpful for all those conversations, just to like take away kind of the guesswork and the negotiation around it in the future.
Mhm.
Do we want to jump down and talk about the transfer out process?
Sure. So transfer out of the fund, the school department will provide the report comparing the aggregate expenses. And it will compare actual expenses versus the original budgeted line item amounts. And so the expenses that you could potentially allocate to the reserve fund would be out of district tuitions, special education transportation, special education contracted services, and then also special education legal settlements. And I also provided a copy of the report that shows the budget for these line items. There's a copy of that in the folder as well. So you can kind of just get a sense of like, okay, this is a report, this is the information that we have. And then during the course of the year, we just have to run an expense report to be able to show that our expenses are in excess of what was budgeted. For those that are the 4 major areas where you could have expenses that are paid for by the stabilization. And then just talking about the withdrawal procedures, again, the school committee has creates the budget for each of the line items, and that is the example that I put in the folder. If the school committee determines that a withdrawal from the fund is necessary, we'll make a request by majority vote. And then school committee will prepare a budget report that will be shared with the finance committee. So I wasn't sure, that language doesn't make sense to me. I don't know if that would, if like the kind of the process would be the school committee would prepare a budget report to the select board finance committee, and then they would present to the select board, or if we could just cut out kind of that reference to finance committee, and it would just be the school committee would prepare the budget report. Just read it as.
Seems to me.
And again, the select board would have to approve any transfer out request by a majority vote. It needs to be approved by both boards before we can allocate the expense to that fund. It's a really important part. So we couldn't pay the bill and process it through the warrant process until those approvals are.
And I have a technical question, and I don't know if this is in the actual law itself. Is it a majority of vote of the members of the school committee and the select board at the same time, which would be 6 versus 5? Or is it a vote of the school committee and then comma, a vote of the select board?
A vote of the school committee and then a vote of the select
Okay.
board. So it first goes to school committee. It needs to be approved by a majority before it can then go to
Got it.
select board.
Thank you.
Only question I had on this is I think I know the answer to this, but the
each of these lines are already laid out within that annual budget document.
Mhm.
That, like within this cycle, you already provided us, right? Yeah. So this is something just from a process perspective, but this is not new work that you all
No.
create or something we need to like track. This is incorporated within the annual budget process.
Yes. Yeah.
That's just to make sure. All that makes sense to me. Nathan?
Same. This is very helpful, Katie. The stabilization fund is for expenditures in the current year we did not anticipate. So a question that I would want to confirm, or that the select board might want to confirm, is like when we're looking at this report describing these expenditures, which would show our expenditures are in excess of what we budgeted. I think I would want to know, okay, are expenditures in excess of what we budgeted because there are extraordinary and unanticipated expenses that came in this year? Or is it because we did not budget the correct amount when we created the budget? Now, this assumes it's the former, not the latter. I would expect it to be the former, not the latter. But is there additional information that we should provide to confirm that, like, these were truly unanticipated expenditures? I don't know. Just to nip that question in the bud in the report.
We went into the fake and the idea.
Yeah. So, and that's a really good question. It really does speak to, so the way that the budget is created, we really do create the tuition budget and the transportation budget. It's really done at a very granular level, but it's also done looking at individual students, and we just need to make sure that we are maintaining confidentiality of the students. And so we want to be able to provide information, but we can't, and thinking about like the process of what we're providing, we just have to be careful about how much information we're providing and what information that we're providing.
You could do it at the level of, like, say, for example, it's out of district tuitions. It could be, here's where we knew, like, whatever, $1 million. I'm just going to throw it. I know it's not the right number, but we anticipated $1 million, and that's what we had budgeted for. And then you can show, like, could it be like May unanticipated cost, $150,000 of new, but you don't have to go into the school, the person, the piece.
Yeah.
Like, is there that level you could, beyond that, you do get into?
I do, right.
It's,
And I totally understand the concern too, just thinking about just so many of the conversations that we've had just about some of the budget history. So I hear that concern. I can totally validate that concern. But I think from thinking about the confidentiality, we really could only keep it at a high level of saying, here's the budget, here's what the current expenditures are, here's what is new or anticipated for the rest of the year. There's a gap. And we're using the stabilization fund as a mechanism to close the gap for this year. And then it's really going to be up to the school department and the school committee to figure out how to fund it moving forward, whether it be circuit breaker, operating budget, or some other mechanism. So it really is, it's definitely, you want to make sure that you're budgeting appropriately because it helps smooth some of that year-to-year fluctuations when it comes to the operating budget.
Can I follow up to that?
Yeah, can I add to that?
Yeah.
So the confidentiality piece and how we describe the need to be one thing that Katie just explained very well. But the other part of this is, let's take this year for an example. We started the year with $8,700 in the account. The whole expense line was unbudgeted. And so I anticipate questions like that if in fact the circuit breaker money moving forward isn't used, it isn't funded well, or they don't want to fund our budget, we can't build that to the level that we think it needs to be. The coin on that is two-sided. One coin might be, well, we know we don't have enough money to fund these things. We didn't budget wrong. This is all the money that you gave to us. Do you know what I mean? And then the other side will be, well, you just didn't budget enough for that. Like there's going to be room for Nathan's argument because I've watched it happen.
Yes.
And people would just kind of look at it through their own lens of, well, you just didn't budget well enough. You should have anticipated that. Well, why don't you build into people? Why don't you build into out of district tuitions a year into your regular budget? Well, because we don't have enough money because you haven't given us money to build in that. So there's going to be this natural, potential healthy or unhealthy tension around that. So just to be prepared, like we're not going to work on every scenario. These are the big building blocks that we just need to put in place. But there's definitely, to your point, Nathan, someone's going to have a separate opinion or a view on whether you should have anticipated that or not, or whether why don't you always budget 3 people more, like 3 tuitions more, because we haven't even let us build up our circuit breakers to the point where we even have that capacity. So and I bring it up only because we're actually in that spot right now. We're in the building phase.
Yeah.
And to Katie's point, most districts are able to smooth these things out as they come and go with a healthy circuit breaker balance. So when we get to the 3.5 mark and we're moving from that comfort level, we could absorb something like that and we can move that and make it work. But there could be a year where someone says, well, you shouldn't have that much money in there. Why do we have 3.1 in there? I want that to go down to 2. And that might happen to be the year when 2 children move in. And all of a sudden it breaks the bank of our ability to internally handle that. So it's just not as
Do you think that there's value?
Black and white, you know what I mean?
Do you think that there's value in because as we said, like this is sort of our first pass at it, and then we would go to the select board because it's a combined policy. And recognizing there are so many nuances and scenarios to that when we meet with the select board to go through this and talk about the circuit breaker policy, there is that conversation around almost like, I don't know if you lay out different scenarios, but to your point where you said some districts build this in, this allows them to do this. It's talking about sort of what a healthy circuit breaker balance allows for, what I would call an unhealthy circuit breaker balance creates, like the scenarios, so that you kind of talk about, you've used the word levers before, which I think is helpful, that sort of allows you to pull different levers. And then I think we've talked about this sort of in isolation. And then as we're talking about it, and that's why even talking about this one before talking about circuit breaker is a little hard for me, because what are our assumptions based on? Our assumptions are based on a healthy circuit breaker balance. So without that, this conversation is sort of
half told.
Yeah. And so I guess I'm just thinking about the conversation and how we lay it out and talk about it. And do you talk about circuit breaker? And here's where we are. Here's what it means. There's a question about, well, do you need that much? Well, okay, if we didn't, this is what that looks like. If we do, this is what it looks like. And then you move into stabilization, because I think it's really hard to understand all of the moving pieces and make a decision on this without having an understanding of that. So Nathan, I think your point is well taken. So I'm just trying to think through like the conversation with the select board and how you lay it out.
So I know Nathan has hand up, so I apologize, but to work backwards from, it might be helpful as one way to unpack it as a group, with everybody having a varying amount of understanding of what this all looks like and the complexity of it. In a perfect scenario, working backwards from a perfect scenario, what we're building ourselves towards with our circuit breaker policy. If and when we get to a circuit breaker balance that meets the circuit breaker policy that we're all trying to move forward, of roughly 75% of the balance being in hand. When we get there, this will then be utilized in a certain way, because we're going to have 2 healthy funds working in partnership with each other to back each other up when these things go by. We're not there yet, so we're working to get there. We should vote on this policy knowing that it should be based on an agreeable understanding that our circuit breaker fund should be in a balance at a certain level that we've described. That's a school committee policy, not a select board policy. And that when those assumptions are realistic or in reality happening, this is how this will work over here at the stabilization fund. Does that make sense? Because we're in the
Yeah.
middle of it, so it's hard to describe. We spent like a month and a half describing when you're talking about these things like we already have that money. We're still getting there. Do you know what I mean? So we have to just maybe working backwards from that would be helpful for folks.
Nathan?
Yeah, this conversation is helpful, and I have a couple of things. I wonder if there's a way to codify these principles or this discussion somewhere. I don't think it's in this policy or in the circuit breaker policy, but somewhere. And I can, I'm just thinking about, like, we have a stabilization fund policy, we have a circuit breaker policy, we're using them. And over the years, as people in these chairs change, this conversation that we're having today becomes vaguer and vaguer in people's memories. I can understand in other towns why they don't have, we talked about there's some other towns in Massachusetts who just use the sped stabilization fund because it simplifies this discussion, right? There's like one fund serving one common purpose. It just reduces complexity. I'm not arguing that we do that. I don't think we should do that, but I do understand the appeal of that given the nuanced conversation we're having today. Just to go back to my original question, like I was trying to find a way to have a trust but verify mechanism here. It sounds like that's challenging, and I get that, and I do see the FERPA confidentiality statement. I saw that in the other policies. I wonder if there's a way to just make that confidentiality statement a little bit more on the nose. Like, it says, oh, thanks, Mark. We acknowledge the need to maintain confidentiality per law, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, I'm just riffing. I'm not saying this has to be the language. Therefore, the school department will not be able to share the drivers of these budget changes with the school committee or select board or something. That way we just clarify, what are we actually saying by bringing up this confidentiality clause. I feel like the point is a little vague as currently written.
Specific, sure, specific, yeah.
And so a friendly amendment may be, therefore the school department will have a limited ability to share.
Yeah.
We say not, it
Yeah.
feels like it feels like a wall, but limited ability to share. Because I think you're right. That sentence, Nathan, provides the reason why confidentiality is important.
Yeah. Because someone will ask,
Yeah.
why, what's going on? What is this expenditure about? Even if it's an innocuous request and they don't really, they aren't craving actual specific data. This just clarifies.
Because you also don't want that to become a new debate.
Correct.
Can we just look at the spreadsheet that I included? I think that those are all really good points, but I also just, the black and white in me just wants to, we have a budget, right? We have a budget. Everyone knows what the budget is. We have line items. There's a lot of conversation around the budget. There are numbers and there are, there is backup for every single one of the numbers in the budget. And so,
Is this what you meant?
yes. So I feel like a lot of those questions may come up, but they're all kind of they're hypothetical in a way. And this is what the budget is. We can see 25 expenditures, the original budget from this year, the adjusted budget that we've talked about through the quarterly reports, and the adjustments have been approved by the committee. The revenue offsets, which are all those revolving funds, grants, circuit breaker, those amounts are built in that we've talked about the progress of, building up those circuit breaker accounts. That's for this year. And then you can see the number for next year. So all of the detail is there, I just feel like this is really concrete. And this is all of the backup for all of the conversations that we're having. And so I would hope that it would be as simple as saying, for legal settlements for next year, we know that we have these number of settlements that equal $298,000. We had one more settlement that we had to agree to in the amount of $30,000. That's what the overage is. That's what we need to cover from the stabilization fund. And that's it. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but I just think it's really important to there's lots of conversations.
Yeah.
The budget is
Yeah.
the budget is what it is. Those are the numbers. That's the backup. So and that's why the report is important, because we want to be able to confidently say, this is based off of a lot of information, but it's accurate, it's up to date. And if anything that is unexpected comes in, that's when we're going to need the help from the stabilization.
Yeah, I agree with that, Katie. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, and from my perspective, this is in a good enough place that we can share this with the select board, and maybe they come back and say, oh, here are other things we'd like to ask y'all to provide to us, so we can have a further conversation. But I agree with you. I mean, I think that the budget is helpful, is what they would need. And to your point, I think even with that, there are going to be situations where we'll come up to select board members who will still have questions and say, well, why didn't you do this or that?
Yeah.
It happens like that. Monday morning quarterbacking happens all the time within budget
But
process.
rooting it in the budget numbers, I think is a great idea.
Yeah.
That's exactly that's where you have to start. You know what I mean?
And the budget is the policy document, and that's what's driving the work. So
Does this committee feel like the document is in a good enough place that we could forward it over to Megan and Winston? Is this we're financed advise on it?
Yeah, I do, and I also think that this may need to come along with an appropriate context setting conversation for those folks, whenever the right time is for that. So when they read that, they might have questions, and we might want to be able to sit with them at some point in time, provide the context. All the conversations that we're having right now would be helpful for them to understand why the language is what it is. Yeah.
Right, so why 750?
Yeah.
So
So there's
it's
just
not right.
nuances that we want to make sure they understand, because why would they understand it if they haven't sat through meetings like this, go through the work? You know what I mean, it's a very unique feature of the budget.
Yeah.
That has a lot of nuances that it really provides context is really important.
Yeah. I can also share a copy of this as well.
Yeah.
When we send it over, but I think definitely at some point before we finalize this, we'll have another sit down meeting and talk through some things. Okay, so I will send that over. That somewhat brings us the next couple of things on our agenda. I know we're at 9:09, so we kind of just probably need to start wrapping. Katie provided kind of within the folder the revolving accounts policy, which is kind of still the draft version. Changed circuit breaker now to kind of 75%. There's one thing I wanted to maybe propose as I was reading through this is, would it make sense to just try and create a separate pull circuit breaker out of that document, right? Because every other line account within there is a fee-driven account. And so I'm just saying it's in 3 policy docs: special ed, stabilization, and circuit breaker, which can look maybe more like what we just had. Okay, Nathan, does that sound right to you? Oh, then I would maybe we next time work on that. I did start drafting. I just made a copy of the sped stabilization policy and we'll plan. There. Started just trying to type something up for a circuit breaker policy. It is not finalized, but started that. Could you look at that prior to our next meeting and just make any additional updates? And at our next meeting, we can talk about this policy. Our next meeting will, to jump further in our agenda. We can't meet next week. We need the time for a negotiation prep session. So the first, we will not have a finance meeting. And it'll be so sad not to have this every week. So we'll be back together on the 8th. My proposal is we would meet and talk about the circuit breaker policy on the 8th. And then potentially on the 15th, maybe we try and get together with the select board, finance committee, talk about the policy on the 15th.
So on the 8th,
I know you can be here.
I can't be on the 8th because I'll be doing the negotiation again.
Yeah,
Negotiation committee on that, so I can meet with them somewhere else and we'll meet. We'll need a good 2 hours that day, and I cannot meet on the 15th.
Do you want to find a different day then?
I think the 8th, I think we can meet without
Right.
John.
Okay.
Yeah, for the 15th, maybe we find a different date. And the 8th, I think we can meet remotely, so we don't have to use this.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can find the space for that.
We can just meet remotely on the 8th.
Do we know, does select board finance have a particular date?
They don't meet quite as regularly, so I'm not sure, but I can ask them.
And then if it's, and I think that one, if it's easier to, could be that, if we're trying to get that one people together. But
Mark, so you're saying on the 8th, we'll talk about the circuit breaker policy?
Yeah.
Do you, I'm just thinking about our last meeting, some meeting previously where we talked about the overlap between this committee and the policy committee. Do we want to cross post it to policy, or do we want to treat that as a working session and maybe have a couple of meetings where we work with them on it?
Well, it's already cross-posted with the full school committee, which is the state committee. So all these are cross-posted. I think what we ran that by Anna, the statement was, again, we would work on it. We can't do anything with it without full school committee approval, right? But we can share that with them. So I think what we can do is, so I think we should meet on the 8th. We should create kind of a draft policy that this group agrees about, and then send that to the full committee, and then we can have a discussion at a future school committee meeting where we talk through the stabilization fund, circuit breaker fund, hopefully the revolving accounts policy as well, and vote and adopt those kind of at full school committee level. So
got it. Okay. Great.
Are we looking for a meeting? Do we think it's a good idea to have a meeting with the when you send over the draft today with the clip for the video of the meeting? Do we want a meeting with just Megan and Winston to go over this with them and invite them to one of these meetings, or do we want to go to one of their meetings? How do we want to introduce that to them to warm the plate of the conversation before it goes to the select board? Would that be something we think about?
yeah, I mean, I definitely think we should talk to Megan and Winston. That going through that finance committee, that's what we've been doing. That continues to make sense.
Okay.
So I can ask them, I think to your point, when do they meet? What's their availability? If they've generally been available on kind of Wednesday mornings, so the Wednesday mornings are getting tight. We could push the circuit breaker conversation on the 8th to the 15th and try and have the meeting with them on the 8th. One of the other time pressures here is obviously the election and then the board turnover that is going to happen post whatever that date is, the 28th or whatever. And our last school committee meeting is the 8th. Is that right? Or do we have one on the 22nd?
The 22nd. So that was
22nd.
like, that was just what I was, if there's a way to do a first reading of any of this on the 8th, it would allow a second reading on the 22nd.
Are you sure we have
Yeah.
a meeting on the 22nd?
Oh,
I
wait,
don't-
that's vacation. Never mind.
No,
8 and 28, I mean, 8 and 29.
But 29.
29 is a range.
Yeah, so the 8th is our last meeting before the turn in the committee. So we're not going to make that date.
I
Okay.
guess my other question though about the policy, tell me if I'm overthinking it, is do we need to have a conversation about circuit breaker at the same time? Like, do we need to have talked about our circuit breaker policy prior to the stabilization, or does it not matter? Do you think?
I mean, I would like to,
With the-
I mean,
with
to
the
your point,
select
I think we should, with the select board.
With the
So-
finance, select board finance.
So they don't control that
No, I
policy.
know, I just didn't know if from the standpoint of, or do we talk about it, to your point, in the context of best case, sort of, here's where we are, here's where we'd like to be. Because I think that informs the why of the number and how you use it. I don't, but
Yeah.
if that pushes things back,
I just think I think we talked and shared the idea of the 75% kind of number with them. I think that's been shared a number of times with them. I think we still kind of have continued disagreement on vision for circuit breaker, but again, that isn't necessarily under their purview. This one is. I think if it informs our conversation, and then as we're having a conversation with them, we can provide, to your point, the rationale and how this ties to circuit breaker, and maybe that changes or doesn't change how the select board sees about this policy. I don't think we need to have an established circuit breaker policy from the school committee prior to that conversation. I think we generally have alignment on, the percent number that's generally been talked about, and there, I think, other aspects of that policy that are school committee specific that really don't affect the select board. I think the one piece of the select board is what is the level of funding level we're trying to get to in the circuit breaker policy. That's how I think about it. Lizzie?
Back to the timing piece, I just would like to encourage us to, even if we can't have a second reading on any of this before your term ends, Amanda, I do believe we should have a robust discussion at the full school committee on April 8th of whatever we are prepared to discuss. I'm not advocating brushing any of this, but I feel like it's really important to put stakes in the ground on this conversation at that full school committee level before the committee is reorganized.
Yeah.
Even if we're not able to bring it full circle with you, with us, Amanda. So just putting just advocating for that. I think it should involve the conversation about the circuit breaker piece, and then whomever joins the school committee following the election can fold into the conversation, and that's fine.
Lizzie, and just a quick process question. Can there be changes between the first reading and a second reading of a policy, or does it need to then go back to a first reading?
No, I think that's intended as part of the process, would be that the discussion that occurs during the first reading
Yes. Okay.
and in turn lead to changes so that the second reading, reflects what has been discussed.
Yeah.
But I
Sure.
just don't want to wait to start that process until we have at the table someone who, by definition, will not have been part of any of this work of these many months. And meanwhile, not allowing Amanda to participate in it when this has been something she's put much work into.
Nathan?
Lizzie, I just wanted to confirm, you're talking about the circuit breaker policy in all of those comments, right?
I'm talking about both.
Okay.
Circuit breaker and special ed reserve. This is one of the awkward things about the timing of our elections in regard to it's just we're not going to be able to sort of complete this scope of work as the full committee that has been working on it all year. And so that is what it is. But I think that we should just put something in place that is like in process. That's what, and because the policy process is designed to, spread out over at least those 2 full school committee meetings. That's really all I'm talking about. So,
Yeah.
arguably the special ed reserve policy would be even more of a priority to move ahead, because we seem to be that's what we've been focusing on here, for example.
So that's why I asked. I think I feel like we will end up having to prioritize here. I am more concerned with the sped stabilization fund policy. I think in discussions we've wanted to get that. Ideally, I would like that policy to be finalized in time for town meeting, so that when town meeting is asked to vote on it, they understand the policy that's going to control those funds. And
agree.
Just depending on, I don't know what the cadence of meetings are, if the select board's going to review this policy and ask us to weigh in again. I don't know. I could just see it taking a little bit longer than we expect. And I don't think we should feel obligated to. I think we should try to get the circuit breaker policy across the finish line. And if we can do that before the election, that's great. But I don't think that, I don't know. I want to get the sped stabilization policy complete. And if that delays the circuit breaker policy vote, because of the calendar, then I sort of feel like so be it. As the rookie on the committee, you have to come in and start taking votes and get up to speed very quickly, and that's just how it goes. And so that's what a new person will have to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to get both of them done, but from a timeline perspective, we have the 8th. We have the 8th for the full school committee meeting. I think if on the 8th we can talk about a circuit breaker reserve policy and essentially do what we did today with the sped stabilization, that we can get a policy draft to a place that we feel good about, then we can take a vote through the 8th to recommend the stabilization fund policy and the circuit breaker policy to the full school committee. And then the night of the 8th, we can read both those policies for the first time and talk them through, to Lizzie's point. So that, I think my understanding of the conversation today is we feel in a good place where the current sped stabilization fund policy, the piece that is necessary is looping in select board. So I think we might need to schedule a separate meeting with select board then with the finance committee. And then I have no idea what their timeline is, because the policy doesn't really matter if we have it and the select board doesn't have it. And so why don't I try and talk to Megan and Winston, try and see if we can, I will send the draft and again, the recording of this meeting as soon as it's ready, but I'll reach out to them today, see if we can schedule time. If they want time to talk through it tomorrow, maybe they look at it and they're like, yeah, this looks totally fine, because it's very much like the ones we've already shared the draft versions with them. They've already reviewed those. But I think probably trying to schedule a meeting with them either next week or the week of the 6th, sometime separate from, it'll probably need to be the 6th or the 7th just to get their input before the conversation of the 8th. That's like a narrow window. But in any situation, one of the driving factors there is just how we coordinate with the select board on the sped stabilization fund policy.
Is there any reason why, we could switch the date if it's important and we're crunched for time and we want to discuss circuit breaker and we feel like that we're trying to cram a lot into the 8th that week, that we could find a different date next week or find a time to meet?
And then offer the 8th for the select board?
But we could do, I guess I'm just saying both. Is there a reason why we couldn't meet next week if there's a lot that we want to get done prior to the 8th and we want to have a conversation about? Because this took a lot of time for this, so I imagine the other one will. And I know that I keep hammering it, and I completely understand there are 2 different policies, but I do feel like having an understanding of the full context of special education reserve funding, whether you're calling it circuit breaker or you're calling it sped stabilization. I find it very hard to have two different conversations about a policy when one is so informing the other. And so I just, if we had the opportunity to talk more about it.
As this committee or with,
As this committee.
Yeah. no,
This finance committee?
Yes.
Yeah.
So could I just say, isn't this finance committee comfortable with the circuit breaker policy in general, in the sped stabilization fund policy in general?
we don't have a circuit breaker fund policy in general.
Well, in general, it's saying 75%.
75%.
Yeah.
And
Am I overthinking?
no, I don't know. I'm just trying to unpack. So if we all feel comfortable, I think the missing piece from my eyes within the school committee flow of the work is Anna and Bao in their current role as policy folks. What is the way to expedite both of these through their policy group into getting it to full? And I'm not sure if there's any technical measures there, but if we need, they should come, if we want to meet like next Thursday, for example, and do this again. And they actually have Winston and Megan here as an example, and go through this, just try to get as many people involved in cross posted meetings as full school committee, finance, and policy. Like, let's just get it all moving. And we're all the same people, we're all the same information. And that can be, I'm just trying to create a cleaner workflow of the types of meetings that we have to have by statute in order to get the work done by somewhere around the 8th as much as we can.
Yeah, I just don't know if this needs to go through.
If it doesn't, then that would be great. Because
Yeah.
if it's a full school committee, it's a full school committee. Someone asked that question. I don't know the answer to that question. If it doesn't, then great. Because we can just vote it as finance subcommittee votes the recommendation, full school committee votes the new financial.
Yeah, I think it still would need to follow the policy approval process at school committee level of the two readings. I don't think there's anything I've seen within school committee policy that says it has to go through
policy to get there.
policy,
Okay.
that there's no way of
Okay.
approving a policy unless it goes through.
Got it. Okay.
Technically, it can just come to full school committee. So
then it's.
I think your point on, I think your point on trying to find a time next week makes sense. I think it really depends on the select board. If the select board said they can only meet on Wednesday morning, and so the 8th is it, then I think, to your point, this group should try and find a time to meet on a different morning next week or a different time next week. To have the circuit breaker conversation, so we can try and have both those conversations. Because again, I agree that I think they're aligned, and I just, getting to Lizzie's point, both the first readings kind of done by the 8th. So we can just kind of really have a nail in the coffin here right after the election. The rework meeting would be great. Nathan? Sorry, I know you went off camera. Your hand, I don't know if that hand's new or was still up.
Oh, it's not new. Sorry.
No problem.
No question.
All right. So I will reach out to Winston and Megan and see what they want to do about meeting and try and schedule that for next week, or at least prior to the 8th. Thank you. Really appreciate a lot of work. We've met. It's crazy that we have met every week for like the entire year. It still feels like we don't have enough time.
I know.
It's just nuts. So thank y'all. Anything else that we should discuss? If not, I will take a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, roll call. Nathan?
Yes.
Amanda?
Yes.
I am a yes. Great.
Thank you.
I'll be in touch. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, everyone.